You know, the Hebrew writer said of Jesus, we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with our feelings of our infirmities, but was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. Jesus lived a sinless life. Yet at the same time, Paul said in Romans 3 and verse 10, there's none righteous, no, not one. And Paul says, of course, in Romans 3 verse 23, that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. When we see those passages, we recognize that all of us have sinned. All of us. And you know, the message today is supposed to be faith in the face of temptation, as we're studying the life of David. You know, David came on the scene in chapter 1 Samuel 16 as a shepherd boy that's being selected to become the shepherd of Israel. Chapter 17, of course, we find that great battle between himself and Goliath. Chapters 18 through 20, we have that great relationship between David and Jonathan. We see also in chapter 21 the idea of the victories that he is winning. Then we also, moving into 2 Samuel, we begin to see his great victories in the first 5 chapters of that book. In chapter 6, we see a blip in his life. He moved the Ark of the Covenant in a way that was not acceptable in God's sight. But in chapter 7, we see that God has come to him and given him a promise that he wanted to build God a house. But God said, no, I'm going to build you a house. That's the church that we read about. That's in 2 Samuel 7. Then we stop and look at chapters 8 through 10. We see great victories that he accomplished as the warrior. But the situation changed in chapter 11, verse 1. We're going to be looking at chapters 11 and 12 this morning in 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel 11:1, it says, then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. And when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? David sent messengers and took her. And when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I am pregnant. I want us to look at this from several things. I want us to first see the great lesson that's going to be faltering faith doesn't have to be eternal fatal. Faltering faith does not have to be eternally fatal. We're here, David, like all of us, have sinned. We sometimes look at how bad it is and think about the murder that he committed, and we think about the adultery that he committed. We think about the other sins that he committed. But yet he's still called a man after God's own heart. How can that be? That'll be a great lesson this afternoon from Will. Who is a man after God's own heart? I want us to look at 2 or 3 stages here as we go through this quickly, and then I want us to close with the important part of the message that I want to deliver. How could David commit such a sin? He is a man after God's own heart. And yet he committed adultery and then murder to cover it up. We see first off it began because David was not where he was supposed to have been. You see, notice the text said it's the spring of the year. This is the time when the kings are out to battle. David gathers his armies. His general, Joab, sends him out to battle, but he stays in Jerusalem. He's not where he's supposed to be, and it's going to lead to sin. Usually that's where sin occurs with us, when we're not where we ought to be. It may be in somebody's house. It might be in some other state of mind. But the bottom line is sin is committed by us when we're not where we ought to be at the time we ought to be there. Another interesting point here, David committed that sin because he forgot what God had done for him. You know, if he stopped and think about it, I think that would have prevented a lot of things. I think the same thing is true with us. Since we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, if before we sin, when we face that temptation, if we could just remember what God has done for us, it ought to move us away from the temptation. Let's think about this as we look at what God has done for him. First off, he's taken this little shepherd boy and made him the shepherd of the whole nation. That's quite a blessing. You know, that's the reason as we looked at him in chapter 17, as Will did such a great job the other night as he fought Goliath. Here he was, just a young boy. We don't know how old, but probably a teenager. And there he was, willing to face that giant. God had already anointed him in chapter 16 to become the next king whenever Saul dies out. And now then, God has made him king over this nation. He has declared him to be a man after God's own heart. That's a statement God made about him. What God has done for him. If he had just stopped to think that night, look what God has done for me, maybe he would not have committed the sin he committed. How many of us might have stopped the sin we had committed if we had stopped and said, let me think about what God's done for me. He's already forgiven me of all my past sins. He's blessed me this way and he's blessed me that way. Surely that would help us if we could bring ourselves to stop and say, what has God done for me? Back up a little bit because I think this is interesting. You know, David, and this is going to go to 2 Samuel 7. David wanted to build a temple to God. Now, of course, God's not going to let him do that. But God comes to him through the prophet, and notice what he says, we'll begin in verse 11. Even from that day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest all around your enemies, the Lord also declares to you, David, that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendants after you who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will bless the throne of his kingdom forever. Of course, he's talking about Jesus Christ being that king. He's talking about the church that's going to be established. The church that's also serves as the God's kingdom. Here is God saying, David, I'm making a great promise to you. In verse 19 of that chapter, he says, it'll be in some great while down the road, but that's going to... You stop and think about that David was going to produce the lineage of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is going to sit on the throne. Jesus Christ is going to establish the church. Jesus Christ is going to come back and save the church. All of that is what God had done for him. Had he stopped to say, let me think about what God has done for me, maybe it would have delivered him in time of temptation. Let's look also at chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, and let's read beginning in verse 7. Nathan then said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, it is I who anointed you king over Israel. It is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care. And I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. Surely, God would have, if he had thought about what God had done, it would have prevented him from committing those sins. What a great thing. Now, what I want us to think about is, but David gave in to that temptation. When he faced that temptation, his faith faltered. What did that sin do? Let's look at a number of things in the text that says what had happened when David sinned. Let's look at verse 9 of chapter 12. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? What did David's sin do? It despised the Lord. You know, when temptation faces us, we usually are only thinking about the pleasure it's going to give us. But really, in actuality, what happens is, it is despising what God has done for us. You know, we would not really want to say, God, I despise you. And yet, when we give in to that temptation, we despise God and what he has done for us. Notice also in verse 14 what it says that David's sin did. Then David said to Nathan, verse 14, however, because by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born to you shall surely die. Two things we see there. David's sin not only was a despising of God, and also, I didn't point it out, but in that verse it's also said, God called what he did evil. Even though this is a man after God's own heart. He is God's chosen one. He is the one that all other kings are measuring their life by. He is, as Christ said, sitting on the throne of David. But God did not mind saying, what you did is evil, and what you did is despising me. But we also see here the other consequence of David's sin. He said, you gave the enemy an occasion to blaspheme. You see, when we violate God's law, when we falter in our faith, when we give in to that temptation, we give folks around us the opportunity to say, if that's what a Christian is, if that's the way it is, I don't want to be a part of it. They have the opportunity to say, you know, people of the world don't do that. People of the world know better than that. And so he says, here's what you did. You gave God's enemies an opportunity to blaspheme. And of course, David's sin caused an innocent baby to die. We ought to have compassion for everybody, but I think we especially have compassion for children. When we see children abused, that's worse than seeing an adult abused. Children are innocent, have no way to defend themselves, and we suffer when we see those children suffering. And yet David brought that on this baby. The baby was innocent. Now, the baby was out of wedlock, but that has nothing to do with the baby. That's not the baby's fault. But God said, I'm going to take the life of the child. And David's sin committed that. You know, David probably had to live with that all of his life. I can't imagine even what it would be like if a person ran over a child with a car and killed them. We've known people, you've known people who've accidentally done that. They probably never forgive themselves for the accident, even though it was not intentional. And so David probably had to live with that all of his life. I want us to see some principles here, and then we're going to spend a little more time really on the great part of the sermon that I think that we need. Of course, the consequences, so we stop and look at this, we've talked about it, and I talked about it yesterday when I had chapters 13 and 14. You see, chapter 12:10 says, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." The sword never departed from David's house. I mean, as we talked about it yesterday, from that time forward, and that's one of the things I wanted to kind of see the contrast. When we start with David in 1 Samuel 16, and we go all the way up to here to chapter 11, things are great. Now, he does have that problem of moving the Ark of the Covenant, but when you think about how much information is all about good, everything that's happened, and it's all blessing, and God protected him from Saul's attack. God has protected him and saved him. God has blessed him in so many ways. Now then, beginning in chapter 11, when he committed the sin, we find that the sword was never going to depart from his house. And thus we saw in chapters 13 and 14, Amnon's rape of his half-sister, Absalom's killing of Amnon, the conflict that arose between Absalom and David, just all kinds of difficulties and hardships. That's what happened. That was a consequence. The principle is sin brings consequences. We looked at a number of passages yesterday about that idea. When God says, "He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting." The consequence of sin is God is not mocked, he said. Numbers 32:23, "Be sure your sin will find you out." Hosea said the sins of his people in chapter 7, verse 8, is that they sowed to the wind and they reaped a whirlwind. Sin has its consequences. And so we see this situation. Here in this situation, it is, of course, first off, that the child himself died. Many of the sins that we commit bring tremendous consequences. Sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes harming other folks, but sin brings the consequences and has consequences. A second principle that we see is that sin can be committed by the greatest of people. He was a man after God's own heart. God saw him in a special light because he must have been a special person. Now, when we really study the life of David, there are a number of sins. We usually concentrate on adultery and murder, but he committed several other sins that the Scriptures write about. But we need to stop and think about this idea. Here was the man after God's own heart, the man that's going to produce the lineage of Christ, the man that Christ is going to sit on his throne, and yet he falls to sin. If he can, we can. It doesn't matter if it's a preacher, an elder's wife, the best member in the congregation. We need to recognize that that's a principle that we need, hate to understand and accept and realize, but it's true. And therefore, we need to be on guard. A third principle that we see is that sin always leads to a cover-up. You see, David committed adultery. Tried to cover it up, bringing Uriah home, but he didn't go home. Got him drunk. There's another thing we don't think about. David got Uriah drunk so he'd go home and have a relationship with his wife and produce, and therefore the baby could be his. David tried to cover it up every way that he could, even to the extent of planning Uriah's murder. And you know, it's kind of sad. Uriah carried his execution letter with him back to the field. Because he was carried the letter to Joab that said, put this man up in the front line and withdraw from him and let him be killed. He carried his own execution letter. I think one of the best ways of seeing what sin is about and why sin takes place might be found in Joshua 7, verse 21. It's the story of Achan that you're familiar with, and as they marched into Jericho, they were not supposed to take anything. But as he summed up his life when they discovered, he said, I saw, I coveted, I took, I hid. That's the way it is with all sin. I saw something, I wanted it, I took it, and now I'm trying to cover up for it. That's what David did here. You see, he saw Bathsheba, he coveted her, he took her, and then he tried to cover it up. I think that's a principle of sin, no matter what the sin may be. Another principle that we can see is God called this evil. Now, this is his favorite man, as it were. This is a man after God's own heart. But God said that was sin, that is evil. And in closely connected to it, we can see the impartiality of God. It's his favorite man. It's the man that God is going to use. It's the man after whom Christ is going to come, and Christ is going to sit on his throne. But God did not show any favoritism. Here was his favorite man, as it were, and he suffered the consequence. He called it sin, and he has had to suffer the consequences of it. God shows no partiality. It doesn't matter whether we sin or David sinned. It doesn't matter if it's a public figure that sins. It doesn't matter if it's a leader in the church. God shows no partiality when it comes to sin. God says that's evil. For the last point, I want us to look at the positive side of this. I want us to see the real good that comes of this. I want us to, as I've said it before, I want us to kind of have the statement, a father's or a person's failure does not have to be eternally fatal. I mean, it's sad when anybody sins. It's sad when we do not remember what God has done to us, for us, and we violate his law and despise him. It is sad when we have to suffer the consequences of sin. It's sad when we bring these consequences upon us, when we defy God, despise his law, do not live according to his will. But God, in his gracious, merciful, compassionate being, says that doesn't have to be the final end. You know, David could have given up right then. But what I want us to see is this. First off, we look at chapter 12 and verse 13, as was pointed out by Paul. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Sin does not have to be fatal if we will acknowledge it. It doesn't matter what the sin is, but if we acknowledge it to the one to whom we've sinned against, it doesn't have to be fatal. Second thing is, and I was going to go through Psalm 51. Paul did that for me, but I do want to go back to Psalm 51, and I want to point out something that I think is significant. Of course, this psalm was written by David as he grieved over the sin that he had committed. And this is the part that I want us to see. First off, we see he acknowledged sin. Now that I want us to see the grief that he had over sin. Look at Psalm 51, and we're not going to go back through what Paul did. He did a good job explaining the text, but I want us to go down to verse 17. As he comes down to his grief and all that has gone on, David said, the sacrifices of God are let me back up to verse 16. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings. So David says, and they were lived under the old law where they had these animal sacrifices, and he said, God, I know that you don't really accept sacrifices. Is that really what he's saying? God had demanded the sacrifices. What does he mean when he says, for you do not delight in sacrifices, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings. Now notice verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. God doesn't want just outward offering of worship. God doesn't want just good deeds to take care of these things. What does God want? A broken and contrite spirit. He wants, and you may be that your heart is broken. It may be that you grieve over the sin as David is grieving over his, and your heart is falling apart. Let me tell you and assure you, God can put it back together if you bring him all the pieces. He has to put it back together. But then notice what he goes on, and I think this is the interesting part. Look at verse 18 and 19. By your favor do good to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in righteous sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then young bulls will be offered on your altar. You know, he's just said that, God, you don't accept sacrifices. But notice there he said you will. What makes the difference? God will not accept the sacrifices no matter what we offer until we have that broken and contrite spirit. But once we have the broken and contrite spirit, we can offer God the sacrifices that he demands, and he accepts it. He will not accept those sacrifices before we have the broken and contrite heart, but he will accept those sacrifices after the broken and contrite heart is brought to God. And so as we stop and look at this, we can see that David confessed, acknowledged his sin. David was grieved over his sins. And we can also see his actions as we look at conveying the idea of his conviction and grief. Notice what he said, what happened in beginning in verse 15 of chapter 2 Samuel 12. So Nathan went to his house. Then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, so that he was very sick. David therefore inquired of God for the child, and David fasted and went and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. Then it happened on the seventh day that the child died. We see the grief of David in that for 7 days he fasted, laid on the ground, grief over what he had done and the sin that he had committed. Of course, he was doing it in behalf of maybe the child will live. Maybe God will let this child live. And of course, when the child died, he got up and ate and went on his way. And so, but the idea is we see the grief of David. Also, let's look at another idea. Look at 2 Samuel 12, verse 20. I got the wrong chapter here. Sorry. Let's look at 2 Samuel 12, and I think it's verse 24. Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. That's, you know, we have a lot of emphasis on David and his grief. We have a lot of emphasis on David and his sin. But Bathsheba was involved in that sin too. She's probably been grieving too. She's the one who gave birth to that baby. And now she sees that baby die. She needs comfort just like David needs comfort. And David went to her and comforted her, maybe in a number of ways, but he also comforted her by fathering another child by her, Solomon. And so what we're going to see here is David is moving on with his life. You know, we need to recognize that after we fall, life must go on. This is the great contrast between Judas and Peter. Judas denied and betrayed Christ. Threw the money back. He grieved over what he had done, but he went out and hung himself. Peter denied Christ 3 times, but he went on with life. He got past his failure. Failure of faith does not have to be fatal. It can move on. And that's what David is doing here. He's moving on with life. He cannot change the consequences. He cannot remove what he did. He cannot change the record, but he can move on with his life. And that's what he does. He goes back to living the normal life. He goes back to serving God. He fathers another child. And it is good that we see in verses 26 through 31 of chapter 12 that Joab seems to help him with this. Joab's getting ready to conquer this city. And he said, David, I want you to lead the final battle. I don't want the glory from me. I want you to get the glory yourself. David got back into the normal routine of life. He now was living on his life. It may be that you have committed a tremendous sin, and it may be dragging you down, but condemning yourself, grieving over what you've done. He said, when you confess it, when you grieve over it, when you prove that you're repentant, when you have that broken and contrite heart, you have to get up and move on with life. One last point as we'll look at it. In 2 Samuel 12 and verse 23, we see after the child's death, David was explaining his actions. And they said, why are you up living now that the child's died? Why you grieved before, you fasted before, why is all of that? Verse 23, but now he has died, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. David had confidence that he was going to heaven. He had committed a grave sin. He could have condemned himself and said, I've lost it all. But what did he do? He said, I'm going to heaven. God, I cannot change the consequences. The baby died and I can't bring him back, but I can go to him. That's the attitude we need to have when our faith falters and we sin. We need to confess it, make it right, get on with life, and have a determination to go to heaven. That's the great message that I want us to see in this lesson this morning. I want us to see that the greatest of people can sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We're all there, and it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter what the sin is. We sinned just like David. And therefore, we need to take the action that David took and determine to live the life for God, determined with confidence that I'm going to heaven. If you can't say that this morning, to say, I'm going to heaven, you need to come forward this morning and make sure that you can say that. If you haven't been baptized, you need to be baptized to say, I'm going to heaven. If your life is a life of sin and there's something wrong in your life and you're worried about it, you don't know that you can go to heaven, you need to come forward. Let us pray with you and for you. We need to have everyone leave this building today saying, I'm going to heaven. We urge you to respond to him while together we stand and sing this song to encourage you to come to the front and make your wish known.